Maple Ridge was known for its quiet residential sections and small-town vibe. It was the sort of town, surrounded by farms and fields, where everyone knew one another and change was rare. David Maxwell, a 40-year-old father and assiduous accountant, had always felt at peace here. He placed a strong focus on steadiness, which was the foundation of his existence. His wife, Laura, is 36 years old. She felt the same way until a few months ago, when she decided to start working at a local real estate business. On the surface, they looked to be the perfect family, with 2 children, Sam, 7, and Anna, 10. Despite their outward aspect, David had experienced a lapse. Their marriage, which had once been filled with laughter and shared dreams, now looked more like a routine to keep their children safe. Instead of fighting or dramatic circumstances, there was an unsettling silence that became louder with each passing day. David constantly wondered if other couples had similar thoughts or if he was the only one who missed their prior level of intimacy. Laura's new work had marked a turning point. When she went home, she told him stories about her coworkers, the majority of whom he had never heard of. Even as he tried to pay attention, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing her new life from the outside. She had always been the quiet, homebody husband in their 11th year of marriage, but the work had instilled in her a sense of independence that made David feel like an outsider. On a Friday night, David unexpectedly met someone while going to the neighborhood booze store to buy a bottle of wine for their planned movie night. "David? Could that be you, David Maxwell?" David heard a familiar voice reaching out to him. David turned and saw Mike. He met a high school classmate he hadn't seen in a long time. Shaking hands swiftly, they were both taken away by their chance meeting. David saw the changes in his friend, a hint of a paunch and more gray around the temples. Mike, on the other hand, maintained his charming smile. For a short while, they laughed together over old jokes and recollections of the good old days. The conversation finally turned to their current lifestyles. "How is Laura doing now?" "I heard she started working with my wife," Rachel, Mike casually added. David smiled and agreed, noting on how well she had acclimated. Then Mike inquired, "You didn't attend to the corporate Christmas party, huh?" David hesitated, taken away. "No, I wasn't invited," he responded, disguising his astonishment. "Laura." The question lingered in the air, triggering a sense of unease in David. He brushed it off with a casual laugh, but the moment felt heavy, like the first crack in a frozen lake. As he walked home, wine bottle in hand, a question nodded at him. Later that night, as Laura sat across from him, laughing at a scene from the movie, David felt a pang of nostalgia. They hadn't shared this light-heartedness in what felt like ages, but now, that familiar warmth was tainted with a tinge of doubt. Why hadn't she invited him to the party? It seemed trivial on the surface, but it felt like the beginning of something larger, something he couldn't yet name but felt One evening, unable to keep his thoughts to himself any longer, David decided to ask about the Christmas party. Trying to keep his tone casual, he asked as they cleared the dinner table, "Hey, so about that work Christmas party? Mike mentioned that everyone's spouse was invited. I thought you said it was only employees." Laura's expression froze, her hand lingering on a plate, and he saw something flicker across her face. He couldn't pinpoint it precisely because it happened so quickly, but it left an unusual impression. She faked a grin and instantly composed herself. "Whoa, that?" Her tone was somewhat too light as she added, "Must have been a misunderstanding on my part." She practiced her response. David nodded as his gut churned, appearing to listen to her explanation. All the information he needs was indicated by the little tension in her shoulders and the movement of her eyes. This was not a simple misinterpretation. In the days that followed, David was struck with feelings of loneliness. The Laura he thought he knew suddenly seemed strange, as if her ideas and actions were locked behind a door he couldn't open. She had become more aloof, frequently staying late at work following meetings and traveling on weekends for training. He couldn't get past the stack of excuses that built on top of each other. David was sitting in his study one evening when he received an unexpected call on the house phone from an unidentified number. He picked up when he stopped. Stillness greeted him. Not a response. The call stopped as soon as it had begun, leaving him perplexed and staring at the phone. Laura's reaction when he sought to lighten the mood afterward was totally different from what he had expected. Her eyes widened and her face tightened as she stammered, "Maybe a practical prank and nothing to worry about." He had never seen her with such concern or unease. That 1 second adds another piece to the puzzle. Another indication that increased his suspicions. David began monitoring Laura attentively and noticing patterns in her behavior that he had previously noticed, motivated by a desire to understand what was going on. She used to be punctual and conscious of her time, but these days her schedule was irregular, punctuated by long stretches during which she looked to be distracted. When he asked whether she would be home late, she offered him evasive answers and funny assurances. As the days turned into weeks, David felt uneasy, his mind clouded with suspicion and animosity he couldn't quite manage. He was motivated by a desperate need to find something, anything concrete, to support or contradict the bad beliefs that had taken hold of him. After attentively analyzing Laura's online activities, he decided to do something he hadn't considered before: monitor her internet usage. One evening, David logged into their shared home computer while Laura was working late outside the house, creating a program to emulate her behaviors. He couldn't shake the unsettling, invasive sensation that had settled into his chest. After a few days, he discovered he had never seen an email account named Bright Sunset before. Every email was like a new piece of knowledge, and each word demonstrated how the marriage he thought he knew was gradually disintegrating. He focused on one interaction in particular. A satisfied traveler, Laura and this mystery correspondent began exchanging conversational messages about daily issues. But soon after, he began to sense a deeper closeness, the kind that implied whispers and secrets exchanged. With each conversation, he felt more and more like an outsider, since it referenced to inside jokes and references he couldn't understand. David was keen to learn more, so he investigated and discovered that Happy Traveler was Chris, a salesperson Laura worked with. A site in which business travel was commonplace. Laura's chuckles during business lunches came flooding back to him, all laced with suspicion, which hardened his determination. He had to take action or let the lie persist. David began to plan a strategy since he felt both misled and raged. He was going to confront Chris square on and break the cycle of silence that had consumed his life. However, he needed specific evidence that would disclose Laura's genuine motives. He called a private investigator, but he was uneasy about paying someone else to snoop on his wife. He decided to take charge and manage the situation himself. David recognized that he was looking at Laura more intensely as he waited for his moment. Every giggle or missed grin seemed to carry a greater meaning each time she picked up her phone. And then, finally, the opportunity he had been waiting for arrived. Laura casually said that she would be attending a business function on the same day as Chris. I had planned a work trip to a nearby city. That was enough confirmation for him. David drove to the site he had located in regard to Chris's leased flat later that night. He stealthily parked his car down the street, his pulse pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. Observing from his lofty perch, he noticed an increase in his heart rate as Laura's vehicle arrived at the apartment. She looked around to ensure she was at the proper area before entering. David's heart stopped when he watched her leave through the door. David couldn't contain himself and contacted her, hoping she'd persuade him otherwise. Her voice was calm as she talked, hiding any emotions that could have been present. David, hi. I was the only one at the gathering. I will call you later because it is a bit loud here. Are you sure? You're at an event, Laura, he said, gripping his hands and shaking his voice. For I believe I just saw you enter Chris's flat, she said after a startling silence, her voice trembling. What exactly are you talking about, David? What you are thinking is real. But David was aware of what he'd seen. His fists tightened around the phone as the realization of her deceit fell heavily on him. As he hung up, he felt angry, sapping the last ounce of his patience. With his brain full with rage and hurt, he dashed towards the flat, ready to confront Chris and put a stop to the incident. David's wrath propelled him forward, a cyclone of pain and betrayal propelling him with each step towards Chris's flat. As he neared the door, his hands trembled, and he couldn't concentrate on anything but Laura's falsehoods and reasons for them. He hammered on the door rather than knocking. He heard muffled voices within, and his heart raced. Chris was astonished to find David standing there when the door abruptly opened. David stopped him off before he could reply. He burst in and peered around the room before focusing on Laura. She stood there in wonder, her face pallid and her large eyes filled with guilt and horror. What's this? David demanded, his voice unsteady and angry. You have been fooling me for several months. Were you just waiting for me to uncover the truth? Laura's mouth opened, but no words came out. Chris stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, but David's patience had reached its limit. Stay out of this, Chris, he spat, his gaze fixed on his wife. I want to hear it from her. Laura took a shaky breath, looking away as she murmured, It's not what you think, David. It's complicated. Complicated. David echoed bitterly. You've lied to me, betrayed our family, and I find you in this man's apartment, and you're calling it complicated. His voice rose with each word, the rage within him burning hotter than he could contain. Chris attempted to intervene again. David, listen. But David's control snapped. In a blur of emotion, he lunged forward, pushing Chris backward. Furniture toppled, a lamp shattered. The room filled with the sounds of their scuffle. Laura screamed, stepping between them as she pleaded, David, stop. This isn't solving anything. But David couldn't hear her. All he could see was betrayal, the destruction of the life he had built. He grabbed Chris by the collar, shouting, You had no right. no right to come between us. Laura's voice finally broke through the haze. David, please, I'll explain everything, but not like this. Her eyes filled with tears, her
voice a mixture of terror and despair. For a brief moment, David saw the woman he had loved and married. But the betrayal entrenched in his memory was too powerful for that image to conceal. David moved back, panting furiously, as his grip on Chris loosened. The flat was a tangible depiction of his inner anguish, with smashed glass and upturned furniture. Taking one last look at Laura, he was overcome with emptiness and raw, unguarded agony at her deception. "You wrecked everything," he said quietly, his rage gone from a minute before. "Was anything we produced worthwhile?" Laura could only stand there motionless, with tears streaming down her face. David did not expect a response. He turned and slammed the door behind him, leaving Laura and Chris in the debris of their own creation. The burden of the battles bore on him as he headed back to his car. His heart was devastated, his mind was filled with unanswerable questions, and he felt torn in two. When he returned home, he faced an even harsher reality. Laura had cut him off from the one constant in his life, his children, when she called her parents to come retrieve Anna and Sam. David sat alone in their dimly lit living room that evening, the silence pressing hard on him. He thought about his children. They had been a family, and he felt an emptiness where his trust had once been. For the first time, he questioned whether he would ever be able to rebuild the life he had constructed. It was coming apart. Following David's interaction with Chris and Laura, things quickly got out of hand, entangling. He became entangled in a web of legal problems and psychological distress. Chris filed assault and property damage charges against David within a few days. The local police paid David a visit and quizzed him about what transpired at Chris's flat, going over every detail and demanding an explanation. Though his lawyer encouraged him to portray the incident as self-defense in order to mitigate the consequences, he was very ashamed of what had occurred. Laura was also affected severely. She began to formalize custody arrangements while coping with her own shock and shame, trying to shield their children from the chaotic reality that is unfolding all around them. David, unable to let go of the two constants in his life, Sam and Anna, protested her decision, but the resulting tension only served to deepen the schism. David made things much more complex by taking extraordinary precautions to protect his wealth. To gain control over their shared resources, he shifted money and emptied their common accounts, preventing Laura from accessing them. However, his actions backfired, inciting Laura's fury and exacerbating the custody and asset conflict in court. David felt trapped and ensnared in an indefinite court struggle after hiring a new lawyer to aggressively advocate her interests. Despite the turmoil, David was able to contact his secretary, Emma. They first developed close over work-related concerns and light banter, but Emma became comforted when Peter shared the specifics of his miserable marriage. She had been through the anguish of divorce. She committed infidelity. Their bond became stronger as their lengthy conversations lasted late into the night. David found solace in Emma's empathy and compassion, which stood in sharp contrast to the terrible memories of his marriage. As their relationship progressed, David spent more time with Emma, retiring into the warmth of her companionship. She reassured him that life could continue despite the scars inflicted by betrayal, offering him a respite from the pandemonium. After some time, David and Emma decided to take a chance and slowly begin a new relationship built on trust and understanding. They felt comfort in one another's presence. Even as he embraced this new phase, David's history remained a constant reminder. He couldn't get rid of the memories of the family that had once defined him and the life he had lost. He had a strained relationship with Samantha and Anna. The judicial battles, as well as the psychological fallout from his separation with Laura, worsened the situation. In calmer moments, he wondered if he'd ever be able to achieve the steadiness he craved and whether deceit might finally do lasting damage. With each stride he took, the break in his heart looked to grow larger. He had heard from mutual contacts that Laura and Chris were attempting to form their own relationship, but there was a lot of tension between them. Nobody, least of all David, missed the humor of their strained relationship, but it didn't satisfy him much. Regardless, he knew his family was gone and no new relationship could ever compensate. This made him feel empty. David had not prepared for the finality of getting divorce papers in his mailbox. He had awaited this moment. Signing them seemed like a formal admission of all he had lost, a broken promise, the end of a chapter. Laura was assigned primary custody of Sam and Anna, although David was permitted to see them. They were both emotionally and physically drained from their legal battles, and neither of them had the strength to continue fighting. David and Laura came together one day to discuss the children's schedules. Tension and unspoken words filled the space between them, their memories of brighter times tainting the silence. Laura flashed him a look while they discussed the details at one point. "I never intended for all of this to happen, David," she mumbled, her expression softening. "I had no aim to. I am leaving you." Her voice drifted off, leaving the words unsaid. David gazed at her with a complex mixture of acceptance, sadness, and wrath. "Laura, even if you didn't mean to, you did. In every way that mattered, you were gone. There is nothing left now." His voice was filled with anguish, reflecting the feeling of finality and inevitability that had hung over them for months. Laura and Chris signed the paperwork, divided their things, and attempted to begin their separate lives. However, David learned via acquaintances that their relationship was tumultuous, full of conflicts and regret. David was not happy about this, however. It was a straightforward reminder of the violated trust and actions that had led them all to this point. David and Emma took a step ahead and began building a new foundation. Their lifestyles evolved gradually. They fused as they built mutual respect, shared routines, and comforts that gave their home a sense of stability that David hadn't felt in years. Emma's entrance became a balm, dulling the harsh edges of his grief. They made a promise to create something new, a life marked by understanding and hope rather than betrayal or regret. His relationship with Sam and Anna has become his compass. Despite their initial tension, he worked hard to re-establish the trust that had been broken throughout the tumult. He made time for every school activity and weekend visit, gradually rebuilding the bond with each joke and exchange of words. They gradually stopped seeing him as a dad carried away by the tides of struggle and instead regarded him as a stable source of support. David. Years later, he would recall this time in his life as a challenging era of development, urging him to think about his principles and life aspirations. He was still thinking about forgiveness, hadn't made up his mind, and wasn't in a rush to make a decision, realizing that some answers were not meant to be simple, and that life may still have meaning even in the aftermath of tragedy, offered him peace. One peaceful evening, David and Emma stood in the garden watching his children play, their laughter filling the air. Finally, he realized he had found a fresh start, a new beginning that allowed him to get over his pain. Even while the scars remained, he no longer saw them as wounds, but rather as emblems of the journey that had led him here, a life restored through perseverance, trust, and faith in second chances.